webinars or meetings are actually all preserved, recorded. Speaking of which, Paul, I've got to hit the record button here before we get any further along, or I will forget. Nope, it's recording. You must have done it for me. Anyway, here's the links to those previous videos of the presentations, and encourage you to use those. Feel free to share them with others that you think might benefit. Throughout Dr. Olson's presentation, feel free to just click on the chat at the bottom of your screen down there and type any question that you have. If there's not a tremendous number of people on the meeting today, we can go ahead and just unmute folks, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. Obviously, the challenge is if we get too many people and folks trying to speak at the same time, it causes issues. So we can kind of play that by ear. So Dr. Olson is a professor there at Kansas State University. His area is beef cattle nutrition management. He's involved in undergraduate and graduate teaching there at K-State. His research program is designed to address questions that directly affect beef industry profitability, and his specific areas of research include nutritional management, cattle grazing native range, management of invasive range plants, and effective cat food nutritional management on carcass quality and value. So Dr. Olson, we appreciate you investing the time and the effort to join us today in our Thursday webinar, and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Doc. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Is now the time I share my screen?
Yes, sir, please.
All right.
Maybe, oh, I have to stop sharing. Now go ahead.
All right, can you see me?
Yes, looks good.
All right. So y'all heard that my training is as a ruminant nutritionist, so I'm talking to you about invasive range plants today. You're probably going to want to know why a ruminant nutritionist is doing this. I got interested in this question, or this problem, about a decade ago. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is about 10 years worth of my life. So I want to tell you, or just remind you, I guess, how special the place is where you live. You know, that Rorschach looking blot there on the right hand of the screen shows you the original extent of tallgrass prairie in North America at one time, covered 165 million acres. Today, we only have about 4% of that left, and the largest single chunk is right here at home. And it's special for a number of reasons. First reason is that it's an incredible repository of diversity. According to the Kansas Prairie inventory, there's about 500 unique plants, 700 unique insects, about 185 birds, and 40 mammals that call this place home. You know, on small spatial scales, that makes the tallgrass prairie more diverse than a rainforest ecosystem. Diversity is something maybe everybody doesn't appreciate, but everybody benefits from. You know, the tallgrass prairie sod, bar none, is the best water filter on planet Earth. It's also the most effective carbon sink on planet Earth. And again, everybody benefits from those things. We just have got to find a way to get paid for those as land owners and land managers. All these things, though, these functional things are predicated on a fire return interval between 2 to 4 years. Okay, it's probably the only truly fire-adapted grassland on planet Earth. And this is more preaching to the choir, but it's, I mean, we get, in addition to these ecological benefits, we get a tremendous economic engine that's based on beef cows and stocker cattle. Without any agronomic input, it's capable of producing a couple of tons of dry matter per acre per year, and supporting yearling cattle gains that can exceed 2 to 3 pounds per day. And what that does for the rural communities of the Flint Hills is provide a stabilizing influence. All of our friends and neighbors, directly or indirectly, are pulling their living from this agricultural marvel. And we only have 2 Achilles heels, really, in my opinion, in this part of the world. One of them's already been mentioned. We're almost completely dependent on surface water for our livestock. And when it quits raining, we almost always run out of water before we run out of grass. The other Achilles heel that we have got to try and work around is that because we're so good at growing stuff here in the Osage Hills and the Flint Hills, that outside organisms tend to come in and try to gain a foothold. And what I mean by these are the exotic invasive plant species that we sometimes regret. Now, we know from the 13th chapter of Matthew that invasive plants have been around at least 2,000 years, referencing the parable of the tares. All invasive plants are annoying, okay, but only 10% of them are capable of invading an otherwise healthy ecosystem and fundamentally transforming it to something else, something less functional, less profitable, less healthy. And the ecologists call these plants transformers. Now, an anonymous person once told me that Sericea lespedeza is the plutonium of the plant community. And I thought that was pretty catchy when I first heard it, but I had to think about what that really meant. I think what that person really meant is that wild type Sericea lespedeza is the problem. When we first started looking into Sericea control, first thing we did was we called down to some schools in the southeastern U.S. that cultivated Sericea. We asked them what they do to manage it, and they said, well, shoot, all we do is we let our cows eat it. And we got to looking into that a little bit more. And even though the Sericea that we have here in the Flint Hills and the Osage Hills is genetically the same as the cultivated variety of Sericea lespedeza, it has some different characteristics that have manifested since it got out of its intended boundaries. I think a better way to think about Sericea lespedeza is to compare it to a feral hog. So those cute little white pigs you see on the screen there, if they escape from their farm of origin within just a few generations, they look like this nasty sucker. Okay, the same genetics that are in that farm pig are also in the feral hog, but you put a different set of environmental conditions around that hog and different physical characteristics get manifested. So in Sericia's case, okay, it's got a number of characteristics that make it a likely ecological transformer. We brought it here in the first place into Kansas and Oklahoma to revegetate compromised soils. It tends to do very well in poor soils or contaminated soil. It's a deeply rooted perennial plant. The root structure is what made it attractive for revegetating disturbed areas. But then we run into some of its negative characteristics. When it's left unmanaged, this wild type plant can have a very robust canopy. It tends to hog photosynthetic resources from neighboring plants. It's resistant to grazing because it is scorchingly high in condensed tannins. The cultivated varieties of Sericea lespedeza have between 5 and 8% whole plant dry weight in condensed tannin. We've measured it in wild type Sericea plus 20%. And I'll show you that data in just a moment. And that makes our beef cattle turn up their noses at this particular plant. As you all know, it's a prolific seed producer. One stem can produce more than 800 seeds per year. And that seed, when it is produced, is hard and smooth and has the characteristics for extended seed dormancy in the soil. people have germinated experimentally 70-year-old seed that's been recovered from the soil bank. Up till now, the most common method of dealing with it has been with specialty herbicides. Generally, the triclopyr, fluxapyr combination when the plant is vegetative, and metsulfuron after the plant has reached flowering stage. But a couple of things I'll tell you about that. Whether we intend it or not, herbicide is going to land on non-target organisms, and it is going to kill. It doesn't discriminate. And as we lose some of our critical habitat forbs, I'll call them, we then lose the insects that feed upon those plants. And if we lose insects that feed upon those sensitive plants, we then lose the animals that feed upon the insects. The other thing I'll tell you about herbicide use is that, in spite of routine use in Kansas between 1988 and 2000 of herbicide, that is, there was a 60-fold increase in affected acreage in the state. And right now, we sit at about 500,000 acres out of 3.5 million in Kansas that are affected by Sericea lespedeza. Treating it all in a single year would take about $18 million and completely erase the profit margin in Tallgrass prairie pasture. So how are a bunch of animal guys going to deal with the plant problem? So like I said, about 10 years ago, we started with really basic questions. Okay, number one, how does the condensed tannin concentration in Sericea lespedeza fluctuate over time? This is some of Garrett Creedy's master's work. And what we found, looking at the time interval between August 1st and September 1st, that's when the condensed tannin concentration peaks. There at almost 20%. You just got to move the decimal place one to the left mentally. It's also when the protein binding capacity of condensed tannin maximizes. So, what's the big deal with condensed tannins anyway? Well, these condensed tannins get released from plant cells during the process of chewing. And as soon as they come into contact with a dietary protein, they will bind it tightly and not release it until the tannins encounter an acidic environment. Functionally, what that means is that there is no protein, there's no nitrogen in the rumen available for fermentation. When that's the case, fermentation stops. Okay, next question. Okay, how much will experienced cattle eat if given the choice between Sericea and a neighboring native plant? And with a beef cow, okay, cows that have lived in the Flint Hills or the Osage Hills their whole lives, the number is actually fairly significant. Okay, but the problem, you can see there that the consumption is ranging between 7% of the total diet and 3.5%. The problem is that when that tannin concentration gets really high in August and September, cows will back their consumption off. And functionally, what that means, we didn't know this at the time of the study, but functionally what that means is that when defoliation falls off, when it gets below about 5% abundance in a cow's diet, we lose the ability to damage its reproductive cycle to prevent it from making a maximum amount of seed. Okay, here's a bigger question. How much Sericea will naive cattle eat? By my calculations, folks, about 70% of the AUMs in the Kansas Flint Hills are occupied by transient yearling cattle, okay, that come from all points of the compass. They don't have any experience grazing in this ecosystem. And as you know, the most common production system for those yearlings is intensive early stocking, where they get turned out sometime in April or May and they graze 90 days and then they're gone. Okay, well, during a 2-year study, we only detected Sericea in the diet of yearling cattle one collection period, and the amount was minuscule. And then these cattle are long gone before we even have the potential to damage the plant through herbivory. Okay, next question, can ruminal microbes adapt to a high tannin diet? This is part of Alan McKernan's master's work here at Kansas State. Basically, we took cattle, sheep, and goats. We fed them either a high tannin diet or a tannin-free diet. And then we harvested some of their ruminal fluid, and we fed the rumen fluid a substrate that had a lot of tannin in it or that didn't have any tannin at all. What we found out is that, yes, there is a small amount of adaptation that occurs in the rumen when an animal is chronically exposed to a high tannin diet. But as you can see, comparing the two hatch bars from side to side of the graph, okay, that improvement was very, very small. In fact, prior exposure to dietary condensed tannins only improved ruminal fermentation as measured by volatile fatty acids by about 25%. Not enough, in other words, to do much good. Well, the next question we had is whether or not we could study intake of Sericea lespedeza in confinement. And everybody told us that, hey, don't bother trying to replicate the effects of condensed tannins with a dry hay, because the tannin content goes way down after the hay has been wilted and baled. Well, we decided to try it anyway. We had a group of 50 cows that we fed an uncontaminated prairie hay, didn't have any Sericea in it, for a period of 21 days. And then on day 21, we switched half of those cows over to a hay source that had been harvested the same week as the uncontaminated hay source, but it had a 19% stand of wild type Sericea in it. As soon as we made that switch, okay, there was a small decline in intake that lasted about 4 days. We expected this because condensed tannins have kind of a bitter or acidic flavor. We would probably perceive it as sour with human taste buds. Okay, but after those tannins had a chance to accumulate in the rumen, those cows just took themselves off feed. Okay, and it only took about 10 days for their intake to drop below 0.5% of body weight. So with that model, with that contaminated hay model, okay, we started looking for feedstuffs, okay, that had tannin binding capabilities, okay, and would allow, would interact preferentially with those condensed tannins to prevent the condensed tannins from grabbing a hold of dietary protein. We used polyethylene glycol that Fred Provenza at Utah State had suggested might have some tannin binding capabilities. As our standard, okay, we evaluated a bunch of other feedstuffs that FDA generally regarded as safe, and we found something called corn steep liquor, okay, that is a byproduct of wet corn milling, that at the time of the study cost about $5 a ton, picked up at the plant in Columbus, Nebraska. And as you can see from this table here, okay, in the presence of corn steep liquor, okay, the true protein availability of a tannin plus protein solution was much, much greater than nothing at all, and polyethylene glycol. We thought, shoot, let's see if we can make a supplement out of this stuff. So the question here is, can the effects of condensed tannins on ruminal nitrogen availability be managed? Okay, also did this with a group of cows. They were fed either no corn steep, about 3 pounds of corn steep liquor on an as-fed basis, 6 pounds or 9 pounds. And what we found, okay, is that when animals were consuming this contaminated forage, okay, they had very poor digestibility characteristics, and they had total tract nitrogen or protein digestibility that was less than 0. Okay, that's very dramatic. That's worse than a protein free diet. Okay, at our first dose of corn steep liquor, again, about 3 pounds per head per day on an as-fed basis. Okay, we corrected the the intake deficiency. And at the second 2 doses, okay, at either 6 pounds or 9 pounds, we were able to correct the digestibility problems as well, including protein digestibility. So our next thought, okay, is will that then affect the animal's willingness to voluntarily select contaminated hay versus clean hay? And we used the lowest level of corn steep supplement identified in the previous study. And what we found is when the animals were provided with 2 bunks side by side, one with clean hay, one with Sericea contaminated hay, when they were fed corn steep liquor, they selected about 25% more contaminated hay than the animals that were given no supplement. Whereas the animals that were not supplemented selected relatively even proportions of both contaminated and non-contaminated forage. Our next step was to take that supplementation scheme to the field. And we did this several years ago. We found a ranch down in southeast Kansas that had 20 80-acre pastures, great place to replicate work. The cows on half of those pastures got 9 pounds on an as-fed basis of corn steep liquor per day. That was prorated for 3 feed delivery events per week. And what we found is that every month of the study, there was a numerical advantage in consumption by the supplemented cattle relative to the unsupplemented cattle. But when it really mattered, okay, during August and September, when the plant was both vulnerable to damage through grazing and when the condensed tannin concentration was the highest, okay, that's when we saw consumption by the supplemented cattle really spike. Okay, and we didn't know it then, we know it now, that if you can detect Sericea at about 5% of a cow's diet, that's very near a threshold for control of seed production. So short answer here is that we were really encouraged by these results. We thought we could give the ranching community a non-chemical, natural solution for dealing with Sericea lespedeza, but we didn't think it through all the way, unfortunately. You know, this solution required producers to make about a $6,000 investment in feed storage capability because it is a high moisture kind of a feed. And the performance benefit that we expected to see with summertime supplementation of corn steep liquor was just not there. So we got some control of Sericea, but we didn't get any measurable benefit in terms of animal performance. So we did not see large-scale adoption of that approach. You know, the next thing we sort of looked at is we know that small ruminants like goats are much more tolerant of condensed tannins than beef cattle are. And we also know that there are some challenges with goat husbandry. They tend to have some parasite challenges here in the middle of the US. They tend to want to escape if they have the opportunity. So the fencing requirements are significantly higher for goats than they would be for beef cattle. The unique wrinkle, I guess, that we brought to the small ruminant question is, you know, why not try a mature ewe, okay, that wouldn't require specialized fencing, that maybe doesn't have the parasite challenges in the Tallgrass Prairie region that a goat would have. So in this system, okay, we were sort of focused on the stocker producers where, you know, we graze steers for 90 days in the early part of the grazing season per normal. Okay, and then on half of those pastures, we stocked them with sheep for 60 days between August 1st and October 1st. We did that for 4 consecutive years. And it was like the sheep just read the book. They went after ironweed, they went after ragweed, they went after Sericea lespedeza, to the point where about 90% of the Sericea plants in our research area were strongly defoliated by the end of that sheep grazing period. Again, we had a solution that we could offer to the people of the Flint Hills that, hey, if you're willing to consider a different income stream, either on a custom basis or on an ownership basis, you can get strong control of Sericea lespedeza with sheep grazing. And just to add a little bit more evidence to that, in the pastures that were only grazed in the early season by steers, the average Sericea stem out there made 864 seeds per individual stem. But in the in the pastures that were grazed by steers and then subsequently by sheep, okay, that number fell to about 114 seeds per plant. Okay, we were pretty excited about this result. It had what I'll call a very strong visual effect. And after the first 3 years of the study, you could see the number of robust adult plants was getting visually smaller. The pasture raised by steers and by sheep. Now, as you can imagine, folks, a lot of people wait in line to learn how to become sheep farmers, sheep ranchers. We did get a few early adopters that figured out the economics of how many sheep and the price of profitable in this part of the world. But I would say that was a very small number. And we got to 2013 and 2014, we were absolutely strong. We needed to take a different approach. That was not only focused on meaningful control of Sericea lespedeza, but was culturally acceptable in the Flint Hills. So the next question we ask is, what decided to change something that we already do? And you see that little man in front of that fire line there, that's me. I look like I'm crying if I should be. I'm out of that fire line and I'm shooting that. And really want to practice to drive fire in the Flint Hills. Very tough. And we thought that March, April are the only times that we can acceptably use to prescribe our achieve the management goals of set ourselves for human resources. And what we decided to do is to move that burning season to a different time of the year, one in which Sericea would be physically vulnerable to damage, to control with prescribed fire. So in this 4-year study, okay, we had 3 replicates of each treatment, and our treatments were burn it in April, burn it on the 1st of August, burn it on the 1st of September. And this is on canvas, is all green, but technically we're still talking about the summer. Temporarily, it's compatible with intensive early stocking as we practice it in the Flint Hills. We took the approach, and we thought we needed to take the approach where we burned annually for 4 consecutive years to evaluate the potential control for Sericea lespedeza. But the ranching community in the area has already significantly improved upon that approach, and I'll touch on that in just a minute.
You couldn't hear me.
So, sorry, getting a little bit of background noise there. But, when we burned these treated areas for 4 consecutive years in the early spring, midsummer around August 1st, or late summer around September 1st, we saw a significant decline in Sericea lespedeza basal cover. Okay, you can think about that as the number of individual Sericea plants going down. We started at about a 7%, 7.5% stand. And with that fire treatment applied at the right time, okay, we really didn't influence the early spring Sericea stand, but we cut into it pretty sharply with our August 1st and September 1st fire approach. And at a cost of about 75 cents an acre, most of the practitioners would use prescribed fire anyway, just at a different time of the year. Okay, the individuals that survived got substantially smaller. Okay, the average stem in an early spring fire regime weighed about 4 grams. The average stem in a midsummer or late summer fire regime weighed about 0.5 grams. So much smaller physically. And when we looked at seed production, this was really dramatic. In this study, individual stems made, I think it was 716 seeds per stem. In the midsummer treatment, that was about 33 seeds per stem. And in the late summer treatment, that number there is not 0, but it's close to it. That's less than 1 seed per plant that came out of, or that was produced following that late summer fire treatment. So just to prove a point, okay, this benefit in seed production, seed reduction, was realized every single year of the study. Okay, this is all the seed that we harvested from 100 stems. Okay, in a spring burn there on the left, an August 1st burn there in the middle, and a September 1st burn there on the far right. Okay, the visual difference was pretty dramatic. Okay, fast forward to the last year of the study, the 4th year, that effect was still very, very real. And one thing that's maybe less evident, okay, from this photograph than can be appreciated, although we did get some seeds with that August 1st treatment, the seeds were immature in their appearance. They were green and soft, and we're in the process of finding out right now if any of those seeds actually could be germinated. Okay, so far we haven't had any success. So I love to show people this picture. Okay, you can see where the fire was stopped. Okay, and about the middle of the screen, everything on the right has been influenced by the fire treatment. Everything on the left of the fire line has not been influenced. So, you know, a human being riding around on a four-wheeler with a spray tank on the back is not going to see all the Sericea plants that need to get treated. Okay, a human being in an aircraft or in a ground application rig that's doing a broadcast treatment is going to have some of that herbicide intercepted by the plant canopy, and it's not going to reach the soil surface where those juvenile plants are. A sheep or a goat walking around the prairie looking for something to eat is not going to see, not going to detect all the Sericea plants and defoliate them uniformly. Okay, but fire does not miss a trick. Okay, when you've got an adequately prepared fire and a good condition for a late summer fire, every plant in the path of that fire is going to be influenced by treatment. You know, people expect the aftermath of a summer fire to be black and slick the way it is in the spring, and that's not the case. Immediately after the fire passes, there's a bunch of standing green material, including Sericea, that looks like it wasn't much affected by the fire. Okay, but if you come back in 48 hours, everything has been top killed and rebooted. And what I believe has happened here, probably two things. Number one, okay, when the Sericea regrows following that fire, it just doesn't have enough time to reproductively mature. The other thing that I think is contributing to control here is that fire is a very important germination tool for a variety of plants, including Sericea lespedeza. Fire has the effect of scarifying the seed coat. And it doesn't matter if that fire happens in April or it happens in September. Okay, the net effect is going to be to scarify that seed and allow it the opportunity to germinate. Okay, when that happens in April, okay, the plant, the new juvenile plant has a whole growing season to store root carbohydrate reserves and maximize its survival odds for subsequent seasons. Okay, in September or August, when that happens and that Sericea seed germinates, effectively the plant has to use all of its carbohydrate reserves to initiate growth. And then when the killing frost arrives, okay, the plant is much more susceptible to winter kill as a young immature juvenile than an adult plant would be. I think that's the other avenue of control that we're seeing here. So a legitimate question to ask, okay, is what happened to everything else? We radically change our prescribed fire paradigm. What did we do to the other things that are important to us? Okay, real quickly, we did not change peak forage biomass as measured in about mid-July by moving our fire regime to a different time of the year. Okay, and we ended up with marvelous regrowth, especially on that August fire treatment by the time we got to the end of the month of September. Wouldn't you love to develop some replacement heifers on forage that looked like that? Okay, we didn't change any major plant type classifications in terms of relative abundance. Total grass cover was the same. Warm season grass cover, cool season grass cover was the same across treatments. And the amount of annual grass was the same across treatments. Where we did have some pretty profound effects is on the forb community. Okay, even though our total forb cover did not change based on fire regime, we had some major shifts in the perennial forbs, the ones we tend to think of as being native and good. And we got a little panicky, so we looked into, okay, which of these perennial forbs are really changing? Well, the top of the list was Sericea Lespedeza. It went from a starting point of about 7.5 down to less than 2% in the case of our most effective treatment. Okay, a couple of other major players that were not being eradicated, but being controlled, okay, with this late season fire regime is Baldwin's ironweed and Western ragweed, the perennial ragweed. Okay, I can probably live with that as a land manager. But probably the most important effect of all of this is when herbicide was excluded from the system and we just rethought our prescribed fire management, we saw this wonderful and visually detectable proliferation of what I'm calling major wildflowers. Okay, you can see the list there at the bottom of the screen, but these plants are either all legumes or they are nectar-bearing forbs upon which grassland obligate insects and birds depend. Okay, and in an early spring fire regime, we had just 0.6% of the total plant population making up that collection of wildflowers. But as we moved our fire later into the year, we had an increase of 50% and an increase of 100% in August and September, respectively. And so the conclusion from this study is that not only did we hit the targeted plant, but we had almost nothing in the way of unintended negative consequence. Okay, and we had some unintended very positive consequence on habitat quality and prairie health. So I'm going to geek out on you just a little bit. You know, one of the ways that we think of gauging prairie health is with the number of native species that are present. That's called richness, and how diverse the grassland is, which is a combination of the different species that are present and how evenly they're represented in the plant community. So as we moved our fire regime later into the year, we actually got more native species showing up, significantly more. And among the forb population only, okay, we got improvements, measurable improvements in diversity. So to wrap things up here, this is a 10-year-long process that's ongoing. And you know, one of the things that we learned is that most of the value of rangeland to our society can't be qualified with, you know, simply thinking about animal production or animal-based revenue. Okay, some other things have to at least be considered in our Sericea control approach. You know, we didn't know a lot about the biology of Sericea when we started this process, but we got to a point where we could apply some pressure on it because we spent some time thinking about the basic biology of this plant. And picking away at it long enough, we were able to identify some points of vulnerability, some Achilles heels. Now, the other thing that we learned, and this is just a practical lesson for any researcher, is that for most invasive organisms, Okay, we've got to have more than one control mechanism in our toolbox. Okay, for years and years, we used herbicide only and it simply wasn't working. It wasn't a long-term solution. Okay, but what else can we put with herbicide usage by way of grazing activity or by way of an alternative fire regime to create a multifaceted control mechanism that will allow us not to eradicate, I think that's an impossibility, but to naturalize the plant to our environment and in fact taking away all of the natural advantages that Sericea has over our native plants. Well, again, when we started this process, we didn't know any of the answers. We didn't even know how to study it. Okay, we had to learn from one another. We had to learn from our students, different techniques to evaluate the plant population, different techniques to evaluate what animals are consuming versus not consuming. And it was an interesting process to say the least, but it was important that we sort of break out of our dogmatic thinking about how we were trained or what value we have to our stakeholders as animal scientists. The other thing, okay, that we learned is that every location in the U.S., the world, in fact, has tough nuts to crack in relation to agricultural problems. And sometimes these are related to invasive species, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes you are going to share that problem with another region of the country. Okay, but if you don't, you own it, and don't expect buy-in from the outside to help you solve this problem. I mean, most of you are aware that Sericea lespedeza is a federally listed forage crop. Okay, it's sort of the standard avenues of research funding. We're not interested in funding research that was designed to, quote, eradicate or damage a federally listed forage crop. So we had to find some pretty unique research partners. We found kindred spirits in the wildlife realm, for example. We found kindred spirits in the conservation realm that were more than willing to partner with us in some of this outside the box research. And our stakeholders in the state of Kansas were literally clamoring for a better solution, for something that was workable where Sericea lespedeza was concerned. And we kept knocking on doors, and eventually somebody with a checkbook answered and said, "Hey, we think you're onto something here, and we will help you by funding some research that's designed to treat Sericea lespedeza like the invader that it is." So that is the end, and I'd be really interested in hearing some of your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Olson. Anybody would like to type a question? I don't see any in the chat box right at the moment, but I guess I've got a comment question for you, Dr. Olson. Get us started here. So, we, and I'm sure you do too, but we discourage people from harvesting hay on those native meadows late in the season, and certainly more or not more than 1 year if you have to, and I think the assumption is that continual late harvest of those meadows will be really hard on that native plant community. So what do you recommend in terms of how frequent, if you're going to use that strategy, how frequent should you do it? And the second part to that question would be, most of our folks down here that don't use much hay through the winter, in that area of the ranch, you would be burning up your winter feed supply. So how do you balance that along with the timing?
Here, I'm writing all that down so I don't forget any part of it. Well, the first part of that intrigued me because it was a biosecurity statement of sorts. I've heard all kinds of stories about how wildlife and cattle can drag Sericea seed from place to place. And I don't doubt that some of that happens, but honestly, we have yet to demonstrate significant consumption by any species of Sericea lespedeza when there's viable seed on the plant. Okay, and that includes, you know, a lot of wild birds. I think that human beings are probably the most effective vector of Sericea dispersal, chiefly with the machines that we operate injudiciously in areas that are heavily infested. You know, here in the northern Flint Hills, the sort of the focal outbreaks of Sericea lespedeza a decade and 2 decades ago were along highline right-of-ways, where there's mandatory brush clearing during the fall of the year. And it just sort of expanded out from those highline right-of-ways in an area of about 7 counties that was pretty easy to detect visually. And the second part of your question, Dave, is if you're thinking about, you know, using prescribed fire as a potential control mechanism, you know, how often, how do you deal with the lack of forage availability through the winter? Well, as is the case in almost every circumstance, you know, the industry kind of picked up this fire solution in 2016 before we were even done with that study and ran with it, you know, really maybe out of desperation more than anything else. And they discovered 2 things pretty quickly, that on a large commercial scale, that when you're trying to apply growing season fire in 2 consecutive years, it can be a challenge to have enough litter accumulation to carry the fire. And so the largest practitioners of growing season prescribed fire for Sericea control are doing it every other year. And they're moving the fire to different locations to affect the control. And that's, I'm not going to name any names, but there's a significant operation there in Osage County, Oklahoma, that's into its 3rd year of that approach to fire. And I was there. I was on that location back in January, and driving down a particular county road that I'm sure you've all heard of. It runs up to 4 Acre from the south. Okay, you can see the results of no fall fire on one side of the road, or no summer fire, and 2 years of fall fire on the other side of the road. And the visual effect was absolutely stunning, absolutely stunning. Okay. So when it becomes, you know, used less frequency than every other year, you simply, you know, for stocker guys and for cow-calf guys, it just becomes a matter of moving that fire patch from one fall to the next. You know, I tell people pretty consistently that what we're hearing is that you need 2 summer fires and 3 growing seasons to be able to visually detect a treatment difference that's satisfying.
Okay, very good. Here's a question. I think there's a question mark at the end of this, so I think the question is this what you were saying? Best combination is fire, sheep, grazing, and then spray?
Well, I think we'd be a little silly if we said, okay, we're gonna totally use just one approach to Sericea lespedeza control. You know, I still think there's a place for spot spraying for real modest infestations. Maybe that's all you need. Okay, if you're thinking about, you know, how to leverage an extra income stream off of a ranch, that's never something that comes amiss, you know, in this environment of land prices. You know, maybe the addition of sheep or goats could potentially be very profitable. Okay, and instead of the Sericea being a financial liability, now it's a financial benefit because you're converting it into mutton and wool and cabrito. The fire, though, I think is probably the most versatile approach. I mean, we have a fire culture here in Kansas and Oklahoma that goes back 150 years. We're comfortable with it. We know how to manage it. From a fire safety perspective, a late summer, early fall fire is very easy to manage compared to a spring fire. I mean, the humidity level is up, the moisture level of the plants is up, the fires just move very, very slowly. Flames don't get very big. A colleague at Region 8 EPA has done some preliminary work measuring sort of the character of the smoke that gets produced during the summer in comparison to the spring. And again, it's preliminary data, but according to that person, the particulate matter that results from a summer fire is about 40% less than the particulate matter that results from a spring fire. And that might have some air quality implications for downwind municipalities. We are constantly getting in trouble with Omaha, Lincoln, and other locations that are upwind from the Flint Hills.
Excellent. I'll give somebody one more shot at one last question. If there are any, just unmute yourself and ask away. Thank you again, Dr. Olson. Tremendous presentation. Really, really good, meaningful, useful information. And remember that his presentation, and just give me about 2 days. May have it posted by tomorrow, but at least in 2 days we'll have that posted to beef.okstate.edu. Anybody want to offer a question? If not, plan to join us next week. We've got another special guest from the University of Madison, Wisconsin, Dr. Kevin Shinners, and he's got some really good practical recommendations on the extensive amount of research that he's done relative to preserving stored, particularly round bale storage, to reduce deterioration. So I think a lot of folks could benefit from his information. We hope you'll join us next Thursday, 12:30, for the Ranchers Lunchtime series. Dr. Olson, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Well, I sure appreciate the chance to join you. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely.